डॉक्टर मैं थोड़ा सा
Yes,
इनका
sir.
जनवरी सेशन है, जनवरी सेशन के सभी विद्यार्थी हैं, तो सितंबर तक तो एलिजिबिलिटी रहेगी मिनिमम।
सितंबर तक
अभी
सर, तो सारे
डेट मेंशन तभी होती है सर, लेकिन क्या होता है कि नॉर्मल सभी सितंबर में ही लेते हैं असाइनमेंट।
अच्छा, let me
सारे इकट्ठे करके
सारे इकट्ठे।
एक मिनट एक मिनट
let
बेटी, एक मिनट रुक
add
जाओ,
a
हम
little
आपको
bit information
जी
to
डॉक्टर
the
जी
assignments part.
हाँ जी सर।
I would like to clarify. Assignments are actually for two sessions. When these are prepared for two sessions. So I think Tejpal is very correct that you can submit all the assignments together, and maybe you can take some time. As he said, I think that will help you out. So you complete all the assignments and submit them in one bunch.
Okay.
In September, sir.
It in September for all codes, right?
For all
Yeah.
course. Yeah.
So I would suggest that you go through the assignment questionnaire and you see how the questions are put, and whether the questions are clear to you or they seem to be a bit lengthy, or any such issue which is not clear to you. So we will discuss the assignments in the beginning of the sessions tomorrow, because I thought the assignments are part of the discussions, and these are very important, since you have to pass, obtain a score, pass score individually in the assignments as well as in the term and examination. But assignments are more important because normally it is believed that if you can attempt the assignments uh, uh, properly, or rather I would say you feel comfortable with attempting the assignments, that means 50 to 60% preparation is there if you have
Yes.
that kind of feeling while attempting the assignments. So we will discuss them tomorrow in the beginning of the session. So we will go to the today's scheduled discussion straight away now. So today we are discussing the block 3 of MDE-411, which the course is Growth and Philosophy of Distance Education, as you have been already discussing it and going through the subject material contents. So today we are discussing block 3. Yesterday we discussed the philosophical background of distance education, and during the discussion we discussed the definition of distance education, and I think you will remember that we discussed quite a few scholars who have given different concepts of distance education, how it came to be defined as distance education. So some people say it's independent study, somebody says it is home study, somebody says it is autonomous study, flexible study, autonomous study, then independent study, individualized study, and then we came to a stage where we thought it was correspondence courses, correspondence study, then distance education, then open and distance education. We also discussed the characteristics of distance learner in the emerging globalized era, how the distance education and the open and distance education is being shaped because of this emerging learner. So there was a bit of lengthy discussion, but it was very important because all these small bits put together gave an idea that we should have a form of education which would probably be catering to the needs of the society. Because day before yesterday we discussed the distance education in terms of credibility. So that was very important. And when we talk about the credibility, definitely we have the quality concerns along with it. So we discussed how distance education has done justice credibility and justice, how it has proven to be a credible form of education, how it has changed the educational scenario of the country, how it has brought people to further their education. So all those issues we discussed yesterday, then day before yesterday, and then day before that. So today we are discussing growth and the present status of open and distance education. So this topic is equally important. Reason being that distance education has grown quite rapidly, uh, uh, just about in 40 years duration, because distance education has been there since long in various forms. But if we talk about the present day distance education, which we now today call open and distance learning, ODL or ODE, then we can say that it has probably began in the late 60s, early 60s or the late 50s, and then early 60s, 60s, then 70s, and during 70s and 80s there was a lot of consolidation, especially with the setting up of United uh, Kingdom Open University, which is UKOU, which was first credible institution of distance education, and it gave many foundations to the distance education. But we, apart from United Kingdom Open University (UKOU), in India, Dr. Uh, B.R. Ambedkar Open University at Hyderabad has also played a greater role in propagating distance education in the country. Then Yashwantrao Chavan State Open University has also contributed significantly. But a major change, a major addition came to distance education when Indira Gandhi National Open University was set up with an Act of Parliament in 1985. Not only that, IGNOU has changed this scenario, but it has also helped, the distance education to grow around the country and beyond the country. So it has worked as a national university with the international jurisdiction. So there are a lot of issues which we will discuss in the today's session. Uh, Actually, before we go to the historical perspective in terms of distance education, there is a small concern about distance education, and this concern was addressed by the celebrity scholar of distance education and very renowned professor John Daniel. He was the vice chancellor of United Kingdom Open University, which is UKOU, and you see he gave he was very prominent in talking about distance education, and also he is considered to be in real terms father of distance education. So you see he made certain observations which are quite interesting to learn. He said
So can we have, sorry to interrupt, sir. Can we have the name again, please?
sorry.
Can we have the name again, please, of the pioneer for distance education?
Yeah, he's Professor John Daniel.
John Daniel. Okay. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, he was the vice chancellor of United Kingdom Open University,
Okay.
UKOU.
Thank,
And
thank
you
you, sir.
see, what he said, he made very practical observation. And the observation was, he said, there is no theory of distance education. You see, this is very interesting statement. He said there is no theory of distance education. And definitely his observation was based on the practical aspect of distance education. Why did he say so?
Yeah.
What he said that each country has its own practices of imparting education. And I think you will agree that
Right.
when it comes to the when it comes to the regular education or face-to-face education, we were using different terms, right?
Absolutely.
I am using these terms because these have to come there alternatively. For even one single phenomena, you have to use different terms to define it. So sometimes we say regular education, sometimes we say conventional education, sometimes we call it face-to-face education. And so I'm using all these terms so that you remember these terms, because when you go through the material, all these terms will alternatively, frequently, will keep on changing. So you should not be confused as to what we are referring to. So he made a very interesting observation that there is no theory of distance learning. And that was very true. Look at India, we have a very long tradition of Shruti and Smriti. If we call about the education in the Vedic era, then we had Shruti and Smriti. That means we would listen to the words from the mouth of teacher, and then Smriti means then it will be remembered by the pupil or the student, or if we call the student. And subsequently, there was a system that it would be passed with the same tradition to the further generations. Eventually, the level of memory degraded, and then there was need to record it, and then it was in the written form. So, but that is not the case with Europe, America, Australia, New Zealand, or many other areas around the world. So, in that sense, John Daniel is very right that there can't be a theory, because if there is a theory, that means the theory has to be applied universally. But the system of distance education or distance learning has been there with in each country, in each region. There are several different and individual or the respective approaches of the nations, of the regions, of the community. Even if we say that each community has its own, traditions, its own way of imparting education. Look at it in India itself. We have gurukulas for a very long time, where we had the antevasis or the residents, the students who will go to the teachers' house, and then they'll study there. They will stay there for 12 years, come back, and then be part of the society. I mean, all sorts of different practices are there. Then we have madrasa system, where the pupil will go to the madrasa, the school, where Maulvi or the teacher will teach them. And similarly, in tribal areas, we have very different notion of education, and definitely, but we cannot say that education is not imparted there. There is also a system where the education is imparted. Perhaps the education has different purposes there, to how to spend life, how to make livelihood, and so forth. So, because we have to see education in a broader perspective, you see, it is not only based on letters, but it is a life living, learning how to live your life. So I think he was very right, and the comment he made was very pertinent. But even then, there are certain theories, there are certain principles, there are certain philosophical background. So each country has its own practices. Now, what happens? This is very interesting. Basically, primarily, I am a professor of translation, but I have been a teacher of distance education also, and also practitioner of distance education at different regional centers prior to be faculty at the headquarters. So I have seen, during my tenure in the regional service, that each region, if we used to visit different places, and then we find different feedback from people. They said, no, we don't learn this way, we learn this way. If you go to tribal Lahore and Spiti, then you have a different place where different system of learning. In Gompa, there will be students who will be sitting, one in the veranda, another one in the sanctorium of the temple, somebody on the roof, somebody in the nearby field, and each one is reciting the sacred texts, and they are learning from them. So maybe once a while during the day they will meet the teacher and receive the instructions and then go about their own business. Some are reading, some are working, some are doing slide forming, and so forth. So what happens? Now each region, each society, each community, each nation creates its own theoretical base for the education. So it is same for distance education, that the theory for distance education evolves from the community or from the practice. So we must remember that when we talk about the historical perspective of distance education, we must acknowledge that we each our society, then other society, each society has its own background of teaching learning practices, and there are some principles which have emanated from the practices of the respective communities, different respective regions, then maybe nations, and so forth. Because if you look at small nation Papua New Guinea, which has been very prominent in distance education, then but at the same time, if you look at a giant country like India, then we can say that in some countries maybe one or two communities are living, but in India you see there are so many communities, different traditions, different regions. They have their own practices, and out of those practices, the philosophy of distance education gets coordinated, and eventually a small base is built for the systematizing the distance education or any form of education. That is one. So this was to discuss with you a kind of phenomena which is usually not associated with the written history, but it is definitely there. And we must see that in different countries, there are different type of societies, there are different types of lifestyles. I mentioned you about the loss with the experience. Similarly, if you go to the tribal areas of Chhattisgarh and Jharkhand, you can see how people live. But even then, they have a system to impart education to their children or to their adults, if you talk about distance education, because people keep on learning throughout their lives. So, so this was one point I wanted to share with you, and because I have met John Daniel a couple of times when he visited India, and it was a pleasure to talk to him and discuss. He was so plain personality, very simple yet very emphatic, and had a lot of experience with distance education. Now, if we come to the social history of distance education, Latin social history we call it because education has been need of the society. So we are not putting here history in terms of history uh, per se as such proper history, but we are talking about the educational history. So social history of distance education is because distance education has evolved from different societies. So we have to look upon the different countries where the distance education has evolved as a social need. I'm using the term social need. Social need in the sense that if you look at the European countries, we are we are taking examples of distance education from the countries where it was actually social need. If you look at America, if you look at Europe, Great Britain, or the other nations of the European nations, then we find that in practical terms, there was not much need of the distance education because they were able to cater to the requirement of higher education through their existing systems. So we are largely talking about the countries where it was system was such that either they were newly independent countries or the countries which didn't have a sufficient or ample infrastructure or system of higher education to cater to the needs of all the aspiring learners. So, first of all, we look at Indonesia, because Indonesia has been one of the pioneers in distance education. So, if in 80s in Indonesia, it was found that tertiary education, the tertiary education, we all know it is a plus beyond 10 plus 2, but with undergraduates. So there was no system. There was a system for primary education, for for the middle education up to 10th standard. And because it had been ruled by Dutch and other European countries for quite a long time, so the Europeans didn't build the base for higher education or beyond primary, essentially a primary education. So it was felt that those people who are actually educated at the primary level, but there was no system in place for higher education. And prior to higher education being society, being country which had a large base of agriculture and marine resources, so they need a type of education which would not be higher education in real terms, but a kind of tertiary education where some vocational aspect will be there. So, in order to cater to the needs of uh, youths and other people who would require to be trained in kind of different vocations, so they set up a body, and in Indonesia, in around 19 late 70s and early 80s, a kind of movement began in Indonesia, and then Terbuka University of Distance Education was established, and primarily for providing tertiary education. It began with degree programs much later, but it was one such university which was set up in Indonesia around 1980s to cater to the needs of large population which was educated at the primary level, and then it had aged, but it didn't, or perhaps there was no provision for proper higher education, yet there was need for tertiary education to orient them into some kind of living livelihood education. So that was there. The second social history of distance education relates to Korea. Now, this is very important because if you look at the Republic of Korea, if you look at it today, then we perhaps wouldn't believe that in Korean Peninsula also there is some history of early form of distance education. But you see, the in 1980s, 1970s, the situation was not such. Last in the vast industrialization was a much later phenomena. But in the beginning, to address the need of the growing nation and to be part in the process of development, there was a need for developing youth for the future industries. So in Korea also, the large population was oriented through informal form of education. It was not informal. Informal, it was informal that large number of students were, or rather youths were gathered at one place, and then they were given instructions remotely at many venues through one centrally controlled agency, So this was also seen as a form of distance education, or as a form of non-formal education. I think we are using the word non-formal way of education is also one type of distance education. Now, if we go to the little further, then we come to Thailand also. If we you might have seen that in Thailand also there is a very strong base for a distance education. There is a problem with this nation particularly because it had a lot of islands, and about 45 to 50% labor comes to the to to the mainland from the islands, which are scattered and non-accessible. Even some of the islands are not accessible by road, so there are other means to visit them. So, in order to cater to the needs of those islands, the government, extended its support to set up a system, a kind of a distance education program, or a programs which were controlled from the mainland, and they were put through different media like radio, partly television, and also some sort of communication through the written notes to the far-flung islands. So this was also seen as an early attempt to address the needs of residents who were living in the far-flung areas. Now, this is one very important factor of the open and distance education is Bangladesh. Bangladesh is one which uh, made efforts to set up an open university or a system of open university in late 80s and early 90s. They set up especially like audio video cells. Audio video cells means the cassettes will be prepared with the course contents at one place, or videos will be prepared at one place, and then they will be distributed all over the country. And very interestingly, Bangladesh set up a national center or National Institute of Educational Media and Technology, NEMAT, in 1995. This was a very important step that was taken by Bangladesh. And I think today, if we look at the industrial base of Bangladesh, which is emerging as a major center for producing the consumer commodities, especially the garments, then perhaps we have to credit the government for early setting up of system of distance education and also using media, especially media through its audio video programs, and an agency which is responsible was NEMAT. Very interestingly, Bangladesh also set up Open University, and we read much about Bangladesh Open University. It has been very active, and it is coordinating with the other universities, other open universities quite extensively, and it is having quite a good network of centers, regional centers, study centers all over the country. And around 4 lakh students are currently studying under the system that is coordinated by Bangladesh Open University. So look at these initiatives which were made late 80s and early 90s that have given the fruits. Similarly, Bhutan, Myanmar, they also have a non-formal type of system for distance education, though they have not set up exclusive universities, but the government has set up, or government has constituted a system which coordinates the education through various modes using radio, television, audio, video material. And let me just inform you here that IGNOU study material is extensively used by these countries to provide programs, and sometimes they encourage their learners to enroll with IGNOU and provide the local support through the different government agencies. A very important aspect of distance education is that which has emanated from Hong Kong. Hong Kong Open University is one very important institute which was established in the mid 90s, and it was felt in Hong Kong that in order to cope up with the pressing demands for the very fastly developing industries, there was need to orient people in industrial setup, to train them, to orient them, and also to produce a large number of young population which would be working in the industry as well as taking care of the business houses. So Hong Kong State Open University was conceived somewhere in 1993 and established in 1995, has been playing a very important role in the arena of distance education. So same is the case with Japan. And I think you will be surprised to know that in New Zealand also, the distance education has its roots from early 80s, and then university was set up around 1995. There is also a very interesting history about distance education in New Zealand. Perhaps we are aware that New Zealand is also a country of a lot of islands, or rather there are a lot of places where the tribal population lives and still lives, and they have their own protected zones, and the people from mainland cannot enter those islands or those restricted zones. So in order to cater to the needs of those residents which were inhabiting in these zones, the government set up initially a kind of agency which was to produce study material in terms of posters, in terms of notes. Then those were distributed, and eventually an university came up, and it is offering special programs for these areas which are under restrictions, because people from mainland cannot visit those areas, cannot travel. There are certain sanctions. Of course, people can visit, but with the government's special permission. But those people who are living there, they are free to, visit the mainland and the major cities, major centers, and they can reside there. But people from mainland are somehow not allowed that frequently to visit these islands. So, in order to cater to the needs of these islands, there was a system which was developed, and that was form of distance education. Similarly, in Philippines also the same conditions were there. So if you look at the history of especially social history of distance education, one thing perhaps will emerge here from our discussion, that the idea or the notion of distance education at the early or initially was not to produce engineers, doctors, managers only. Of course, maybe later on some people took up higher education and then they became managers, engineers also. But the basic idea was to provide livelihood education, an education which would deal with the social issues of the respective regions and the residents, those who are residing in those regions. So that was the social history of distance education. And let me just share with you that in Australia also, there is a very important state university, which is working under the control of the government. And industry provides now very prestigious programs, which includes higher education in terms of management, engineering, computer sciences, and many other upcoming disciplines. But in the beginning, it was also felt that since Australia has a very far-flung residents living in the areas which were not accessible, and it was very difficult to provide education through the formal mode. So, in early 70s, an agency was set up which made surveys, and then it was suggested that initially an agency would work, coordinate with people of the respective regions in the far-flung areas uh, that will study their needs, and especially the livelihood skills based programs, vocational programs were offered through the different agencies. Eventually, an industry was established. So, we will read much about details a little later about the Australian Open University. So, this was the social history of distance education in, we can say, in Asia, Australian continent. There wasn't much talk about the social history of distance education in America or in Europe. Reason being that there existed already a system which was taking care of the basic education or the vocational education of their citizens or the respective states or the respective people. Now, we will come to very important aspect of the distance education. And in distance education, when we talk about the Indian scenario, then there are very interesting phenomena about education in Indian context. I think I have already said, discussed with you that for a very long time we had practiced education through Shruti and Smriti. Listen and remember. That was the mantra of education in the Vedic era. So, from the pastoral India, we know that India has been basically an agrarian society based on the economy and livelihood based on krishi or agriculture. But at the same time, we had a system of, I think you heard about Aranyakas, Brahman, and Upanishads. Actually, Aranyakas are not any, are basically the commentaries on the Vedic literature, and which was meant for those who were actually living in Aranyakas in the forests. And then Brahmans who were actually practicing the rituals of Vedic prescriptions, and Upanishads the etymological meaning of the word Upanishads or Aranyakas is those who are residing in Aranya. Aranya is one or the jungle. So, because in those days Rishi Munis were residing in the, basically we had forests. Perhaps I am not aware that there were too many cities, but primarily the large number of large body of people were living in the Aranyakas. So, for their education, Aranyakas were prepared. Similarly, Upanishads who were coming to the teachers' residence, and they, because Upanishad, those who live nearby, for their education, there was Upanishad. So that was a system of education in the pastoral society in the early India. Of course, for a very long time, the practice, as I said, that was based on Shruti and Smriti. And eventually, when the power of memory slightly degraded, then there was a need to scribe them, and we had the written form of literature. So then it was a system of education that was Guru and Shishya. And perhaps the Gurukulas were part of that system of education. Beyond that point, we had another form of education, which was the feudal India. If you look at Indian perspective, we're talking about Indian perspective, social political changes. How did these impacted the education system of our country? So this is just a case study. This is just gathering points from our social history, how we had practiced our early educational system, what changes did it undergo in between? Because from early period we had the Mughal feudal lords. So during that period itself, the Nalanda and Takshila, these two very prestigious universities were set up. But because during the feudal India, we had largely the lords and the invaders. So these invaders, they tried to destroy our ancient system of education, and different lords would also invade the educational system, the institutions. Largely, we had pathshalas and madrasas during this period when we had the lords and feudals ruling our country. So, if you look at the early period of Mughals, then you could see that there were lords, and then they connived with the Mughals, and eventually Mughals took over the nation, and then they set up their own system of education. But before the Mughals took up, Sanskrit was a dominating language which was playing very important role, and we had pathshalas, which were the form of schools that we have today. Similarly, then with the impact of the Mughals in the country, we had the madrasas set up. But let us remember that at some point of time, maybe 8th to 10th century, that was considered to be a golden period, and during which Kalidas and other scholars contributed a lot to the poetics, astronomy, and commerce, the various other disciplines of education. People contributed quite extensively. So we have to remember that history. So of course that is different part. But as far as the educational history is concerned, we had specific branches in which there was celebrity scholars, and those scholars were recognized by Persian and Arabic regimes also, and many walks of the scholars traveled across the Arabic Peninsula, Persia, and eventually landed in Europe. But then we come to the colonial India. We know that in the colonial India, the system of education that was there, which was based on Gurukulas, Pathshalas, and Madrasas, was systematically broken. And we all know what was Macaulay's policy. So then English-based system was introduced that was meant to develop or to produce a white-collar job suiting people. So that was there. So then we had independent India, and eventually we came with our own system of education, in which one very important initiative of the government of India was important. That was the universalization of education. That was based on the Radhakrishnan committee report, which was prepared during 1948 and 1949, which paved the way for universalization of education. So today we have education for all, and many other initiatives, but all these are basically the offshoots of Radhakrishnan Commission report, which was set up in 1948, and it prepared its report by 1949. And then on the basis of this particular report, it was felt that we must universalize the early for basic education, and at the same time, education for all, or the educational equal opportunities of education for all. This idea also adopted by government, and it was felt that there should be a system for the provision of education, irrespective of caste, creed, and color. There shouldn't be any restriction, region region, from the community, from the racial point of view, from any discrimination on the basis of class, creed, and color. So this was if you talk about the social history or socio-political history of education, maybe some offshoots will emerge for the distance education, but because it was period when we just need education, but maybe we could later on during a discussion in the course 412, we will find how it was also having some traces of distance education. So this was about the social history and the socio-political history of education in India, as well as nearby nations which had the social need of distance education or need of education to address the social issues. One important aspect of education in India, which we have today, is the commercialized education versus industrialized education. This is very important issue because we are talking today about the commercialization of education. What is this commercialization of education, and how did the commercialized element or aspect entered into education? But prior to that, I think we have to understand the industrialized type of education. Now, with the fast, with the need of fast development in the country, there was need to speed up the industrialized education, or education which was based on the industrial needs and patterns. But whether this education has really served the country, it has given the results, that is quite debatable. So this case study of India is very important. Why it is important? Why there was need for the industrialized education, or what and how it has contributed? Let us focus on a couple of points. Because India had become free from the colonial rule, and it is believed that at the time of independence, it was almost a pauper country. We were entirely dependent on the Europe, Britain, and other nations for our day-to-day commodities. We had resources, but we didn't have the system to utilize the resources and produce our needs or products that were needed for the livelihood, or for the for proper living, proper lifestyles, proper social needs for the population. And because we needed proficiency in language, that means if India had to become part of the global initiative, then there had to be a language which would part of the overall global system of industry or education. So India adopted English initially as a medium of instruction up to the highest level. That means especially highest level, I am referring to the higher education. and I am particularly making this point, higher education meant in the early 50s, means just after independence, higher education meant management, computer science, industry, agriculture, and trade and commerce. So these were areas which were in those days focused areas of higher education. Social sciences and humanities were not in the prime target of the government. Reason being that it had to compete with the global setup with limited resources, weak political setup, and also there was a strong bias about India because the Britishers had given the freedom. They had declared this to be independent country, but at the same time, there was a large bias about the ability, about the innovations uh, against Indians. So, at the same time, the country itself was not ready for any other form of education other than the formal education. So, all these issues were there, and all these issues were very important and politically very, very sensitive because India had to compete with the fast growing industry around the world. India had to produce managers, engineers, and other force of capable people who could look after the trade and commerce issues of the country. But at the same time, the Britishers or other countries had certain doubts about India and Indian people, whether their capabilities were enough to cope up with such a large nation and compete with the Western world, which was considered to be much ahead in a way. So, within the challenges of all these factors, the government considered post Radhakrishnan commission report that how to train large number of people in the country, how to put them into some sort of training so that they become active participants in the progress in the movement which was there to take the country ahead. So that was considered, and initially a lot of vocational education programs were launched. And because it was not possible to launch, to coordinate and conduct these programs at one place, so a mechanism was developed that a certain amount of literature would be prepared, it will be distributed, and then through remote resources, it will be transacted, it will be taught, if I may say so. So, considering these aspects, I think it was a very important situation in the country, in the beginning of the country, in the beginning of industrialization or the industrialization movement, rather, if you say, industrial revolution in the country. So, the education was primarily for the purpose of giving momentum to industrialization. So, that was one aspect. What as the industries gain momentum, lot of socio-cultural issues also emanated from it. Media was becoming more strengthened, and at the same time, uh, the people were expecting a lot more from the government because government had made certain promises. So people were looking after the government to fulfill all those promises. Now, education here took a turn, and it became a kind of phenomena that everybody wanted education. everybody wanted to go ahead. Everybody wanted to part of the progress and the fastly growing industry. So in that term, the education was then seen as a means to earn more and more money, whether it is industry, whether it is trade, or whether it is commerce. So more and more people wanted education, and eventually the system became so demanding that people were ready to pay for the education. And also, education was becoming a core factor for giving momentum to industrialization, which were ultimately earning revenue for the country. So, commercial issue was there in terms of income that was generated from industry, but at the same time there was need of educated people. So people wanted education and were ready to pay for the education. So in a way, the need was working in two ways. One, there was need of educated people for the industry, for giving momentum to the commercial activities that was associated with industry. But at the same time, education itself was being seen as an activity of commerce, and people were going ahead through various means to obtain education so that they are eligible to be absorbed in the industry and the industrial base. So that was the industrialized education versus uh, commercialization of education. So this education was commercialized, reason being that it was needed, but education was also commercialized because it was part of the commercial acceleration of the industry. That was one point. Let us not move away from the very important aspect that and if you look at the material, there's a it's always written that education is one which democratized, which is a tool of democratization. So, tool of democratization. Education is seen as a tool of democratization. What is, how does it democratize? So, it was seen that education is one such tool which brings a lot of transformation in this society, and in real terms, it is a tool of democratization. So it was said that before we take up the education as a tool of democratization, uh, we must democratize education, because during and immediately after the independence, or prior to independence, education was the domain of a few nations only, few countries only. But when our constitution was enforced, it provided equal opportunities to all the citizens of the country, irrespective of caste, color, and creed. So that was the need of the constitution to deliver justice, social and economic and political justice, liberty of thought, expression, practicing the belief and faith, and also people had their own free freedom to worship as to what they like to. So all sorts of issues were there, and amongst them, a very prominent issue was that of education. So if education was there in the center stage of all these issues that were relating to the political awareness and development, industrialization, commercialization, definitely the education had to be democratized. You all know democratization. What is democratization? I think they not need to explain it. You all understand it. That means everybody should be able to gain, able to get education of one's own choice and needs. So to democratize the education, let us come to the higher education a little later. Initially, it was thought that, as I mentioned, universalization of education, that was a post phenomena of Dr. Radhakrishnan Commission report. So here is a point that how to democratize the education, how to universalize the education. This was a big challenge before a nation like India. So it was suggested that perhaps mass media, radio, television, video, cassettes, and other forms of media can play a very important role in this arena. That is how the concept of ICT, Information and Communication Technologies, came into the forum. And we had earlier system which was not that way very capable of carrying the needs of the entire nation of education. The media, which would be one way, would not be serving the purpose. So there was need of the media or the interactive information and communication technologies, which would facilitate the interactive communication. So such technologies were built, such system was produced, which would be facilitating the interactive communication between the provider and the provided. That means between the institutions and the students or the students community, which was supposed to be benefiting from the system. So here we had a role in the early 50s, then 60s and 70s. The system was gradually built, and it was called the Interactive Communication Technologies, ICT. Later, I think we know that information and communication technologies, initially it was interactive communication technologies, but later on the nomenclature began to refer to the information and communication technology. So this was actually initiated in the early 60s, but it was seen that in open and distance education, the entire dependency on the ICT is not viable. Perhaps you are aware that we had the state television networks. We have certain audio video AVRCs, Audio Video Research Center, in certain universities like Jamia Millia, Lucknow University, Gujarat University, Ahmedabad, and quite a few other universities where we had AVRCs centers. So they were supposed to produce large quantity of audio video materials for the open and distance education. Let me just share with you that with the AVRCs and the mass production of audio video was seen as one very important addition to the distance education, but it was not considered as a major alternate to the distance education, or rather it could not be a tool which could be entirely dependent upon. So it was felt that we must have the open element added to it, whereby we should have a face-to-face component. Now here is a departure as well as linkage with the conventional education. It was felt that there should be a face-to-face component. There should be some component whereby the distance learner is not fully isolated. So the open and distance education, open in the sense that there are entry level relaxation, there are a lot of choices, there's a autonomy of learner to continue education on one's own place and pace, but at the same time, there should be some component whereby the learner comes face to face with the teacher. So the face to face component or the contact programs or counseling sessions, similar such initiatives were undertaken by the government, by the universities, by the distance education, you may say so. So this was basically commercialized vis-a-vis industrialized education and also democratization of education. Of course, democratization of education has been possible because of two very important factors. One, that the constitution made such provisions which ensured the rights, and another aspect of the democratization of education is because of the technology. As I mentioned that there was a issue or concern that there will be fall of standards in education, and fall of standards in education would be because of the lack of the word of mouth. I think all of you will remember that we all thought that if there is no teacher present in the class, there will be no reading, there will be no study. So that phenomena, that stigma, or rather that hangover, was still there. So in order to replace that hangover, in order to get rid of that hangover, that nostalgia, in order to finish that nostalgia, there were efforts to put the teacher through various means. So the value of the word of mouth was, though it was very important phenomenon in education, but there were efforts to replace it through various technological media, virtual classrooms, online education, etc. So all these are efforts which are basically to give you a feeling of the value of the word of mouth or the presence of the teacher. Some people ask what the difference distance education has made. So that means they questioned what it gives. That was also very important, and at the same time, International Conference of the Correspondence Education (ICCE) came into the scenario, and ICC is the first body of for ensuring the standards in distance education was established way back in 1985-86, and this ICC has taken a lot of initiatives to ensure that there are quality concerns which are to be addressed, and this was a kind of we can say the social historical perspective of open distance education in the country, besides India, neighboring Asian countries, and also far off continents like Australia, New Zealand, Papua New Guinea, Indonesia, etc. So this here we will switch over now to the next topic. So do you have any queries right now?
No, sir.
Okay. So now we will take a look at the history of distance education in terms of the international scene of distance education. If you look at the international scenes of distance education, then it is basically to be seen in two different scenarios. One is the international scenario that was Europe, especially, and this another aspect of distance education in the international scenario, which is Asian and also American scene, besides Middle East and also the Pacific nations. So if you look at the development of distance education or the genesis of distance education in 20th century, then we can see that there is a global acceptance of distance education today. Uh, Distance education has been not a phenomenon today only in Asia, only in American, Latin American continent, or in South America, or in Australian continent, or in Asia or Pacific, or Europe. But today, the distance education has been seen as an important component of education uh, all over the world. So, from the European point of view or from the international point of view, if we look at the earlier traces of education, then some people see that, like in the Roman Greek history or the instructive letters that were there to play a very significant role in the Roman Catholic Church, and also in Old Testaments, there are certain traces which were kind of distance education, because there were letters which used to be written and then delivered to the people in different places. So that was seen. Some people say that there are some genesis of distance education or distance instruction. I would say perhaps not appropriate to call it education. There was a mechanism for delivering the instructions. But if you look at the consolidated and coordinated history of distance education in the international arena, then it perhaps in the mid 18th century that some efforts were made to form a kind of education, to form a kind of system to pass on the information by adopting certain measures and promoting education within the four walls of houses, within the communities, within the societies. So that is how the concept of home study emanated. And because of home study was solely by the citizens or people at their houses, there was a need which was felt to address their educational needs, how to address their queries. So there was an element added that is known as a postal tuition or postal education. So postal education, mid 18th century, early 19th century, was very dominating kind of education. And the communication. So this home to education or maybe post is but when student perhaps not the all, but connected to help citizens to help them a kind of which was the first the plus eventually educational skill, and that people started to they would and they would coordinate the and required. That was also forcing. This was the study and the universities in those they were having the four walls. So the sorry, there was a network breakdown. So if you look at the international fora or international scenario, then the very first organized body which was there to look after the distance education, which was in its genesis home study, home tuition, correspondence, correspondent courses, independent, and a lot of other names were ascribed to it. So, but the very first body which came into existence, that was the International Council for Distance Education, ICDE. So this ICDE was actually initiative of Mr. J.W. Gibson. And J.W. Gibson was already working with the Colombian agency, Colombian government in the state of Victoria. And he was coordinating the school level, high school correspondence courses for a pretty long time. So he gave an idea that in order to coordinate higher education, especially in Canada, there must be a body which should be responsible for devising policies for correspondence courses, or now that it had become more popular and recognized as distance education. So he, upon his idea, the ICDE was established in 1938, and the agency was also supported and joined by members from United States, Australia, New Zealand, Scotland, and also represented, by the president of International Council of Correspondence Education. As I mentioned, there was initial body which was International Council for Correspondence Education, and then eventually another body which was International Council for Distance Education was established. So this was meant to coordinate the education post World War II situations. So some very important initiative was supported by USA, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. So that is how we have universities in Australia and New Zealand in early 50s, post World War II. And then in America and in Canada, we already had the Commission for Higher Education, which was eventually upgraded to university centers. So these are some efforts which were there at the international level. We also have to remember that in the other countries of the Euro, there was a lot of need, there were a lot of efforts for strengthening the distance education. And upon these results, a very important initiative which came into fruitful result was the establishment of Commonwealth of Learning, COL. Maybe our learners are aware that IGNOU has been certified as a center for distance education, as in producing excellent study material. And it has been, IGNOU has been awarded a couple of times for with its best center prize, best center recognition, because our study material is of excellent quality, and Commonwealth of Learning, to which Indian government and Indian higher education, distance higher education has contributed quite a few functionaries. And currently we have one of our senior professors working with the Commonwealth of Learning at its top position. So the Commonwealth of Learning is one body which looks after the standards, it looks after the needs of distance higher education in different countries. It has special focus for Asia and Africa. So what it does, it creates and it widens the access of education, and also it holds conferences, seminars, and several other activities. It also finances distance higher education through its corpus. And in Africa, Asia, Australia, Europe, and many other countries, especially in the Caribbean countries, Pacific Islands, it is working very extensively. So today we can see that there is a worldwide dispersion of distance higher education. And we can see that right from Canada to the European nations, to the Pacific countries, to Australian continent, New Zealand, India, and China. There is a lot of extensive network of distance higher education, and people are benefiting in that. We have very important open university in Pakistan, which is known as Allama Iqbal Pakistan National Open University. So these were some efforts in different countries which were there for the distance higher education. If we look at a little more in detail, then we can see that England, Britain was pioneer in the distance higher education, and the very first university in Britain was established in 1969. This was known as I mentioned in the beginning of our discussion, that at Milton Keynes, the UK OU, United Kingdom Open University, was established. And this university has produced a very high quality study material, which was actually there to set up standards for the study material of distance institutions. And UK OU has been there to guide many other universities in different countries even including IGNOU. There are a lot of models that have come to IGNOU from UKOU. Similarly, in France, the distance education has been seen as a very important system of education, and there are centers which is known as CNED, and also the lot of use of mass media, especially France is the country which developed advanced technologies like floppy disks. If you look at the scenario in the 80s and 90s, when we didn't have these pen drives and other things, then we had the floppy drives. So it created floppy drives for higher education also, and CD-ROMs, CD videos, visual conferencing links, etc. Then we had the same sort of practices in Germany and in the entire Europe. So, dear learners, if you look at the international scenario, look at your own continent, which is Asia, very important role has been played. We will discuss one country which has contributed very significantly to the higher education, that is China. China has a very important setup, and we called CRTVU, China Central Radio Television University. This is the largest university, and this university has been there for now almost for 5 decades, and it is offering education to millions and millions of people. The university runs centrally, and it has centers in the different countries. So what we will do is we will discuss I would like to discuss a concept which is the mega universities also. Just give me CRTV. Yeah. So the CRTVU is a very important institute, and it is operating in 28 provinces of China, and it has 43 provisional radio and television universities. Primarily, it is a centrally coordinated university, which is a CRTVU, and as I mentioned, it has television. It has set up different television universities. So now the system of education to distance mode is slightly different. It is not like India or like UKOU. It has set up the television universities, and they are exclusively operating through the television networks. And more than 2.4 million students it is having through its networks, and almost 75% of the enrollment is through radio and television universities. So if you look at the China Central Radio Television University, there is another setup of distance education, which is Shanghai Television University, STUV, and this too is an extensive network of distance education. It looks after the East China, the universities which are operating under this system are like Normal University, Fudan University, and East China Chemical Engineering Institute. This is very important that in China, even the technical education is being provided by the distance education mode, and this is coordinated by the television universities. So, especially if you look at the Chinese network, there are quite an extensive work under the National Open University system. So it is providing the lifelong learning. It is ensuring the equal educational opportunities to all those who are otherwise not able to enroll. And at the same time, it is associating with the traditional colleges and the universities. And also it is there to promote human resources of the country. Now we will come to India. I think if you look at the Indian profile of distance and higher education, it is quite significant. Perhaps the biggest contribution of GER, gross enrollment ratio, in the country has been ensured by Indira Gandhi National Open University, and it is playing a very important role, not only by just itself, but at the same time it is also associating with the other state open universities. So if you look at Indira Gandhi National Open University, it has quite an extensive program, and it operates the three-tier system. Perhaps you will go through your study material and then find out how extensive network it has and how does it operate, and what is meant by regional centers, what is meant by the study centers, the learner support centers. Then it has a very large network of study centers, learner support centers, which where we have the academic counselors and other regional center functionaries who takes care of the students' needs, etc. The overall scenario in higher education in India is quite extensive, where we have almost 475 plus universities, and then we have in which there are central universities, state universities, and deemed universities. And today, if I am not wrong, then we have 14 open universities in the country, which are situated in different parts of the country. So if you look at the role which has been played by the open universities in the country is less significant than the conventional education. Of the and the contribution that the education provided by the distance, the open distance institutes and universities. So one, I think this is not supposed to read anything because it is to reach the and fully provide showed and reach the so that the sections are provided for education. This particular it has established study centers in other where there is for specific which some center for armed forces. It has provided special study centers. Many communities it has gone ahead and centers. It has a base of which were academic counselors. That the in is so whole the dear friends, we come to know that education is this and the specifically then an extensive network of that focus on a very small nation, but it has established a good network of distance education. It is special authority with the Department of External Studies. Though it was 1940, 1994, but it has continued to be there, and it is very active. And it has two mottos, that is expanding the services and also beyond the capital. This is very good initiative, beyond the capital, because Noro being the headquarter, the reach for the distance and higher education has been ensured by this initiative, which is the beyond the capital. So this is a very good initiative. I just mentioned it because I found it quite interesting to share with you that such initiatives have been there with different different governments, but it has worked here really well, and a lot of students are enrolled through this initiative. In the Pacific Island, if we look at the approach, then there has been very encouraging results, and there is a University of South Pacific, USP. The University of South Pacific has also been working quite extensively, and similarly in Fiji, we have at Suva, there is a center which was established. So the university, it was later promoted into university. So University of South Pacific has been there since 1968. So the USP has been recognized as a very important distance education center, and it is coordinating the teachers programs also, though with this limited enrollment. It is coordinating with a lot of other countries to provide different courses, plus 150 courses it is providing under 25 academic programs. So we can see that in the Pacific nation, which otherwise is very scattered, there was need to reach to the different islands. So the USP, University of South Pacific, has been playing an important role. Similarly, if you look at the Canada or other regions, the Athabasca University in Canada has been there since 1970, and it has been working in the field of distance education, especially at Edmonton and the nearby areas. Perhaps what happened that there were a lot of migrants, and they were requiring higher education, which was not possible with the then setup of universities. So to cater to the needs of the new immigrants, this university, the Athabasca University, was established, and it is working from mid 70s till date. So we perhaps will today conclude the discussion, and I would like to invite your queries. What my request would be that you please go through your study material, because there are a lot of small issues, small terms which we can discuss. If you could come up with them, that if there is any information that you need more information that you require on their part. So what in a nutshell we can say that internationally open and distance education as we see it today has come through a long journey, and the small efforts made by different individuals, different agencies, different communities have added various dimension to what we see today. We call it today the ICT enabled education, or internet or technology mediated education. So how all this happened? Because at various stages people gave ideas from their own experiences. As I mentioned right in the beginning, it is very difficult to set up a very concrete definition for distance education, or a concrete philosophical base for distance education. The reason being that at different times there are different needs. With the changing world, changing learners' profile, today we cannot prescribe the uh, same models which were there in 80s or 90s or in 2000s first decade. Within the last decade itself, there has been a lot of changes. We have seen during the COVID and the post-COVID era that the total shift has changed from the students' sports services through regional study centers or the learner support centers. Today we have online focus. The counseling is being held online. A lot of courses, or almost all the courses which are available previously in the conventional mode, that is through the offline mode, today those courses are available on the online mode. So we can see and we can say that it is true that there cannot be a fixed theory of distance education. With the passage, with the progress, with the overall development in the country, the aspirations and need of education also changes. So as they changes, new components are being added, new approaches are being adopted. So we have to evolve our own theory for the distance and higher education, for the open and distance education, so as to make it relevant. At the same time, it is also perhaps not possible to prescribe same principles for all the places, because there are geographical divides, there are socio-cultural differences, there are socio-political setups which are different, and each one see the need of education differently. And there are also variations in availability of resources. So maybe a small community, a small state, a small nation has to decide, has to prepare strategy of its own, how to take forward the open and distance education, and what elements should be added. Of course, there are principles we discussed yesterday, the very basic ideas, how they, from where they emanated, how did they contribute and gave a base to the education. We are talking about home education, home tuition, independent study, individualized study, autonomous study, flexible study, blended study, then correspondence courses, then distance education, then open and distance education, then online education, then computer assisted education, internet mediated education, and so forth, blended education. So there are a lot of aspects which have been added to the distance education, which makes it open, which makes it more open in this sense that now today the learner has greater autonomy, the learner has greater control over reading, the learner is the focus or the center of planning and execution of distance education. So in that way it is open, yet it is highly coordinated, it is highly technical in the sense that a lot of new technologies are working with it, especially if you look at the online education or the computer assisted component in the distance education, which is far greater than the conventional education. So I will stop here, and maybe if you have any query, we can discuss it for maybe 5 to 10 minutes. Or so our learners are invited. Please come forward to have a discussion on the points that we discussed today, which were primarily with the historical perspective of education, distance education, where we mentioned John Daniel, and then social history of distance education and social political changes in the international scenes, how in the different countries small seeds germinated and gave an idea to distance education, how in the Asian continent and the other continents there were ideas about distance education, some institutions were formed. And we also, focused our attention how in China, a big number of, a really huge number of learners are attached to the through center as in and the universities, the convention is a part of the university, which has the control of China Central Radio and Television University Network. So these issues, there are a lot of other issues perhaps our students will point out, and maybe with their own observations, those can also be added to it, because in the initial beginning itself, we read the statement of John Daniel that the time and the circumstances and the conditions itself add to the philosophy of distance education. Do we have any question? अगर कोई क्वेरी हो तो प्लीज आप बताएं.
No, sir.
So can we now conclude this? Oh. Yes, Arti.
No, sir, no query for the day.
So please, I will guide one again. So tomorrow we would like to discuss the right.
Yes, sir.
You, have you all got the?
So your voice is breaking.
Okay, what I'm saying is that have all got the. Am I audible? Oh, I see. There is a network issue. Okay. So we'll see. So you got more.
सब थोड़ी देर के
Your
लिए
voice
वीडियो
is
बंद,
not audible.
तो सब थोड़ी देर के लिए वीडियो बंद कर लें.